Hello and welcome to the PharmaForum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. Of the many changes in clinical trials, one of the biggest potential paradigm shifts on the horizon is the elimination of placebo groups in some trials in favor of synthetic controls drawn from historic data. In theory, this shift in methodology should allow more patients access to life-saving treatments and save trial sponsors money without compromising data integrity. But the devil is in the details, and implementing this kind of thing, getting the right data, getting the regulators to sign off are all serious challenges. So today I'm welcoming to the show Webb Sun, president and co-founder of Komodo Health, and Tracy Mayne, SVP Regulatory and Life Sciences Research of Slipstream IT. Way back at JP Morgan, I heard these two talking about this trend, and we finally found time in their schedules and mine to bring that conversation to the podcast. Welcome to the show, Tracy and Webb.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So maybe just first of all, if you don't mind each taking just a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk about kind of how your work plays into the topic at hand. Maybe we could start with Webb and then go to Tracy.
Happy to do so. Thank you so much for having us, Jonah. My name is Webb Sun. I'm someone who has spent the entirety of their 30-year career in healthcare and life sciences. I'm incredibly passionate about our mission here at Komodo to reduce the burden of disease, both through our own work as well as through incredible collaborations like the one we're going to talk about today. And I think for me, prior to founding Komodo, I saw the healthcare industry from a number of different angles. I was a drug discovery researcher working in cancer and HIV research. I went into pharma consulting, working with everyone from privately held small cap companies all the way to global top 30 across all of the different disciplines from business development, clin dev, commercial, all the way through to operations and supply chain. And so that was a great experience. And then started Komodo to really work on addressing the biggest challenges in healthcare, starting with learning from as many patients as possible and tracing the entirety of patient journeys, the completeness of patient journeys for hundreds of millions of patients in real time. And so that's a little bit of what's inspired me to get to this point in my career, and really looking forward to today's discussion.
And Tracy, you've also had a varied career in the life sciences industry, right?
Yeah, I actually started in public health, also in HIV, and then went over to pharma. And I started with big pharma. I started with Pfizer and Lipitor and Amgen and Epogen. Then did some time in consulting, and then really spent the last 10 years helping startup companies who are really breaking into pharma. And during most of that time, my focus has really been around real world evidence. But for the most part, it was really after a drug was approved. You've done this clinical trial, but you've done it in these really specific patients who, in the end, don't look completely like the patients that are going to actually get your drug in the real world. So you want to know, when my drug gets into real patients, is it still safe? And is it still effective? What is really exciting about this time right now is, there really is, massive change happening where those real world data can be used now in the approval process for drugs, and are being viewed as a legitimate source of data on safety and efficacy that regulators can use for initial or confirmatory approval of a drug. So it's an exciting time to be in the industry where real world data, in many ways, is really coming into its own.
Webb, where you come into this with your current work is really kind of saying, when we say real world data, what do we mean? Where's that data coming from? Are the sources robust? Is it being, if we're pulling from multiple sources, are we unifying them in ways that actually allows us to get information from this data? Talk to me just briefly about some of those challenges and some of the work Komodo does around making the data piece of real world evidence actually work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's the piece around real world data, real world evidence, and real time. And as I referenced earlier, at Komodo, we have this philosophy that to address the biggest challenges in healthcare, you need to learn from as many patients as possible, and you need to be tracing the entirety of the patient journey for as many patients as possible. Now, you take this moment in time, Tracy talked about how exciting it is, being able to combine real world data being captured in real time and combining those disciplines and capabilities with powerful innovation in software with AI embedded as the foundation. I think what it's created is the opportunity for so many different groups to study nearly any imaginable patient population. And to Tracy's point, the industry has gone through a massive sea change. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, actually, Tracy was on the Lipitor side. I was on the Zocor side at Merck in US Human Health. And, these were disease areas where, you could go down the street and find 10 other patients that had hyperlipidemia or hypertension. And in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, what we've seen is an explosion of interest in specialty therapeutics categories, in oncology, in personalized medicine. And what that's created is this opportunity because while there are near infinite amounts of healthcare data available, accessible out there, it's not just about how much data you have, it's also about the quality of that data and your capabilities in bringing it together in a way that makes sense, that unlocks use cases and creating opportunities to give end users, the understanding of how to leverage it. I think one other piece I just share here is I think by combining multimodal real world data with scalable full stack data infrastructures into an integrated platform, we've undertaken the ability to enable our partners to perform robust research with unbiased, comprehensive insights that really drive meaningful impact. And we're seeing that across pharma, we're seeing that across health tech innovators, we're seeing it across advocacy organizations, we're seeing it across our academic partners at Stanford, Robert Wood Johnson, University of Maryland, et cetera. And it's been really, really exciting because we're seeing the impact across all the disciplines, accelerating clinical trials, shortening the time to diagnosis for patients with rare disease, advancing and addressing health equity, powering FDA submissions, as Tracy just alluded to. There's just so much opportunity for us to improve the broken insights workflow and address all of these challenges that are in many ways systemic to healthcare in the US.
So that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask next. And maybe Tracy, you can start on this one, is just what are kind of the pros and cons of using historical data in as opposed to your traditional double-blind placebo for controls?
So let's start with talking about the kinds of data that the FDA has said are acceptable. And they said, look, there are three different ways you could get these data. One of them are disease registries, and the other one are electronic health records, and the third one is claims data. And when the FDA guidances came out, they said, look, we want this to look like a clinical trial. And real world data can be really good, but it's not collected in the same way a clinical trial is. So they want it to be incredibly systematic and standardized. So the registries, the truth is there are a lot of really good academic registries out there, but very few of them are going to meet the incredible rigor that the FDA has specified. The EHRs are very rich forms of data. The problem is they are not systematic in the way that things like claims are. So, for example, I remember doing an EHR study where we found the drug of interest that we were looking at was spelled in 60 different ways between the generic and the actual drug. So there's this additional kind of validation that has to take place with the EHRs. The claims data, though, even though it's coming from different companies, claims data are collected in an incredibly standard and systematic way, which really facilitates a company like Komodo being able to put them together in a way that the FDA finds acceptable. So of those three sources, I have to say that the databases like Komodo are the ones that are the most seamless to fit into that.
Before that there's this inverse relationship between data quantity and data quality where trials have a small amount of very good data, EHRs have a large amount of very messy data, and it's hard to kind of hit that sweet spot.
I think the claims data, and especially when you can take the claims data, because let's face it, within the claims data, you're not going to have your lab test results. For example, the thing that I found helpful about Komodo was really the ability to seamlessly link that to other data sources. So, for example, in some of the work that I did, we needed to have the lab data. And it was amazing how simple it was to link it to LabCorp and to Quest, which is 70% of the outpatient lab data that is being collected in the US. It was really quite seamless. Or the other one is, we connected it with the US transplant registry. because we wanted those hard transplant to be able to compare to the claims data. And again, it was a really seamless link. And what I found really heartening as well is there was very, very little mismatch between the comprehensive transplant data that we found in OPTN and Komodo. It was actually a little scary that the matching was so good. So again, not to repeat myself, but my sense was the claims data with the ability to link it to other external databases ended up being the sort of sweet spot for data to meet the FDA requirements.
Actually, Jonah, if I may, I just wanted to piggyback onto Tracy's comment. I think when it comes to healthcare data, one of the big shifts we're seeing as we speak is a focus on both quality, which you referenced, as well as ever increasing interest in closed lives, in patient complete lives. Now, historically, outcomes research teams have always been interested in closed lives. They need to track these patients longitudinally. They're tracking outcomes over time. And the interesting piece here is other functions have been perfectly happy to work with legacy aggregators to do some pill tracking, to define disease by, what types of comorbidities we see and the drugs that we're using against them. And I think what we're seeing right now, and Tracy can probably speak to this, we're seeing development teams, regulatory teams, commercial teams, and others across enterprise life sciences using closed lives as part of their core strategies, taking a keen eye towards quality and quantity when it comes to their data. And as the FDA becomes more receptive to real world data as a part of regulatory submissions, clinical development teams will be leveraging closed claims to ensure that real world data insights are standardized and as identical to clinical trial insights as possible. And so with closed claims as a backbone, researchers can then integrate open data sets like lab data for deeper insights while retaining a high level of reliability. And, just going back to Tracy's comment, we see so much interest in taking Komodo's healthcare map and leveraging the platform to enhance it through our partners in the Map Enhance ecosystem, like Coda, like Point Click Care, like Trio Health, and so many more that really just add additional dimensionality to the insights that are available through the healthcare map and our platform capabilities.
Well, and actually, you're bringing up a really good point, because the real world data was traditionally the purview of health economics and outcomes research and medical affairs. And now suddenly clinical development is saying, whoa, 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 whoa. You mean I could do my trial twice as fast at half the cost if I can use this real world data? And one of the fascinating things, now having bridged those two worlds, are they really often didn't talk to each other inside these pharma companies. You have the traditional biostatisticians in the clinical development side, and then you had the HEOR people on the medical affairs side. And one of the fascinating things was teaching them to speak each other's language. So now, there is an incredibly specific format that the FDA has to have these data in. It's called CDISC. And the real world people, frankly, had never heard about CDISC formats. On the other hand, the clinical development people had to get comfortable with the fact that you can have some more fluidity with the real world data. And for the FDA, that can actually be accepted. So for example, when I was working in this, we found an ICD-10 code that was part of the endpoint. And when we actually looked at the data, the clinicians were using it where it was clear they were not using it in the way the ICD-10 code was really meant to be used. And if you're on the clinical development side, that means you've got to send a whole new protocol to the FDA for review. But in the real world evidence side, you can have something called a clean room. And you have three external folks who don't know the data, have not seen the data. They're three experienced biostatisticians and epidemiologists. And you can come to them with one of these issues and say, hey, look, here are the facts. Here's our evidence that this ICD-10 code is not working, and we want to take it out of our endpoint. And that clean room is empowered to then say, we have not seen the outcomes data. This is completely unbiased, but on a purely scientific basis, yes, we understand this, and it is perfectly acceptable for you to make this change without having to go through an FDA resubmission. And it took a while for those clinical development folks to begin getting comfortable that there are certain degrees of freedom with the real world data that they're unaccustomed to with a clinical trial. So it's been really interesting bridging two worlds, both of them steamed in science and data, and yet using somewhat different language and helping to sort of bridge between those two.
I want to take a quick detour here because obviously there's a reason why the data is the way that it is, and why, often these disparate pieces don't talk to each other. We really should kind of address the hippopotamus in the room. This data is patient data. It's private. It's protected. There are a lot of rules about what you can do with it, especially in the EHR. How do you get this data all together and mix it up to create this good data without compromising patient privacy or the regulations around it?
Yeah, I'll say, Jonah, this is something that is deep at the core of how we've built the business and how we've essentially institutionalized the healthcare map in the workflows of so many of our partners. Komodo is providing an ecosystem that allows stakeholders to access and act on longitudinal patient level data to address a wide range of healthcare challenges at scale and to bring new health solutions into the market faster while limiting their need to make massive infra spend. Now, to your specific question around privacy, one of the important pieces is from Komodo's inception, we've taken this notion of we want everything that we do to be de-identified, anonymized, and tokenized. Within our platform, there are specific capabilities that automatically change the scope of geography when you're looking at rare disease patient populations, change the N size for different sample sizes when you're looking at different cohorts to ensure that even a bad actor could not come into our map and then go do re-identification of those specific de-identified tokens. And so there's a lot of controls, there's a lot of technology that's been applied against healthcare map construction itself to ensure that, when we cert a specific patient population, when we cert a specific cohort in our platform, that is our stamp saying, unlike the old ways where you go buy a bunch of data and then sometimes it's identified, sometimes it's de-identified, but you're saying, oh, my in-house team will work on it. When we partner with our clients, we hold the cert and we say, hey, this is something where we're giving you a high trust environment for you to do your work in. And you can count on the fact that, we are not enabling patient re-ID. That is not one of the use cases that we support.
But then the smaller your group of patients, the harder it is to pull that off. So if we're talking about a synthetic control for a rare or ultra rare disease and you want it to really closely resemble your experiment group, how do you strike that balance between getting this highly specific group of patients, but also making sure their data is not identifiable?
Yeah, Tracy, you want to take this one? I mean, you just did this with us in Rare, so you're the perfect SME to cover this.
Well, so I think it's important in a clinical trial, the FDA wants source data verification. So they want to actually go to your case report form and be able to go to that very original data. But they understood that with real world data, these data sources have to be de-identified. It is interesting. They want the data sent to them. In a clinical trial, the FDA needs to be able to analyze that data themselves. They want to be able to replicate the analyses that a company has done. So that was one of the issues with the registries, is many of the patients just didn't consent to have their data sent to even a federal regulator. So by de-identifying it, that does allow for the data to be sent to the FDA. And the question of, is there retraceability? Well, there are a number of ways that the de-identification works. So for example, we don't use the actual birth date. We set all the birth dates to January 1st of the year that somebody was born. And the bottom line is, I imagine for 99.9% of the studies, that's good enough. Birth year is just fine. We're not identifying patients by their zip code. It's often by state. So once you take away that age, once you take away that geography, you are getting removed enough that it's essentially next to impossible to re-identify those patients with the data that are available there. And it is interesting working with the FDA. And in many ways, they're still working through, some of these challenges themselves. So, source data is now that claims data. It is one step removed. They cannot go back to that patient. But in some ways, that's the beauty of de-identification. They can't go back to that actual patient.
I was just going to say, this also speaks to the bigger picture, which is the opportunity at hand. And, when you think about the use case for RWD, real world data in rare disease, it's so evident, especially when it comes to things like clinical trials. Now, Jonah, you yourself talked about it. Recruiting from small patient populations is, exceptionally difficult. Using patients in a real world setting as a control arm can really address the feasibility challenges that come with studying these rare disease populations. Now, with the right level of depth of data per patient, applying the right algorithms that are bringing the data together, we're able to go in, generate the patient cohorts, even when there's no reliable ICD diagnosis code for the disease in question. What Tracy and I jokingly refer to at JPM as codeless conditions, right? Being able to look at those populations, build synthetic control arms, can massively reduce the burden of patient recruitment while still driving regulatory grade insights. Now, what that does is it opens new regulatory doors and possibilities for studying rare disease treatments, and in turn, bringing therapies to those patients that so desperately need them.
And Webb, it also brings up, I think, another issue that, despite what we've been told, size matters. It was really interesting. There was a company doing some research in an ultra rare disease, and on their website they said there were only 4,500 of these patients in the U.S. Went to Komodo and said, and there is an ICD-10 code for this one. They asked Komodo to do it, and they identified more than 20,000 of these patients. So the best epidemiology said 4,500. In fact, there were almost 5 times as many patients, and these are patients who are in care. These are patients who could be brought into a clinical trial. And then, Jonah, I imagine your next question is, but wait, this is de-identified. You can't go to that patient. No, you can't. However, you can identify the physicians who are treating these patients. You can go to them and say, hey, by the way, here are our inclusion exclusion criteria. If you have any patients who meet all of these criteria, we would love for you to be able to refer them into one of our trial sites. So again, you are maintaining your de-identification, but you can target physicians who are treating these patients and increase the efficiency of finding, even if you're talking 20,000 patients in the US, that is still a needle in a haystack.
Right. Because if you're a physician, you don't know about all the clinical trials that are going on. So even if you know your patient and their needs, it's easy to miss it if someone doesn't come and make that connection.
Yep. So now you can bring the trial to the treating clinician. And again, there are some companies who are actually going out there and being very creative and saying, hey, you've got 5 of these patients. We would like you to become a clinical trial site. But the easier way is to say, hey, you're within 60 miles of a clinical trial site. If you refer this patient, there would be, number one, benefits for the disease state, benefits for the world. But there are also benefits for the patient, because a lot of their care gets paid for by that trial. And when it comes to rare disease, community physicians are not always at the forefront of knowing the recent advances in rare disease. So your patient is also going to be taken care of by an expert in their rare disease as part of this trial.
I would also say, Tracy, again, just to follow up on your comment, you talk about the fact that the importance of seeing as many patients as possible. As we increasingly have the right high quality data to accurately reflect real world patient experiences, we're also seeing other clear regulatory use cases come to life, especially outside of rare disease. And so one example here is safety analyses. When it comes to demonstrating safety and side effects, real world data can show so much more of the patient experience than just trial data and historical trial data that was being captured, catching more subtle aspects of the patient journey and providing a volume of insight to understand the breadth of, adverse events, impact on safety, et cetera. And so it really just speaks to how, if you have the right platform capability, if you have the right capabilities when it comes to capturing insights in real time, over time, longitudinally, you're really unlocking the ability to see so much of that patient journey and better understand so much of what's happening to those patients and to those cohorts over time across a number of dimensions, not just efficacy, not just outcomes, but also safety, AEs, et cetera.
And Webb, you're bringing up a good point, because the FDA has used real world data for decades to look at drug safety after a drug is launched. Not to bring up any X companies, but you might remember Vioxx, which frankly was a fantastic drug.
Yep.
It was highly effective. It was safer than other NSAIDs.
Yes.
But when looking at the real world data, once you got that into millions of patients, there was in fact an increase in cardiovascular events, and the FDA used real world data to take the drug, off of the market. So what's interesting is the FDA has accepted real world data for safety for decades. It's only just now that they're really beginning to find their comfort in using it to demonstrate efficacy.
So one piece that I thought is really stuck with me from hearing you guys at JPM is this notion that because there's this pressure to get drugs approved faster, and so they get pre-approved, they get out on the market, and then the FDA says yes, but you have to run a confirmatory trial. Then you run into this problem trying to actually have a control group for those confirmatory trials, and you know what I'm talking about, Tracy. But you're good at
do.
explaining it. Yeah.
Let's jump in there. I want you to imagine that you have got a rare disease. There are no effective treatments on the market. The FDA has said, hey, we have this drug, and it hasn't proven that it affects outcomes. We haven't proven that it, decreases death or decreases transplants. But there is a biomarker that is highly predictive of this, and we're going to approve the drug based upon its impact on the biomarker. And then the bottom line is very often it is small startup companies that are doing this work. So they don't have 7 or 10 years to do an outcomes trial. They don't have the resources. So the FDA has Subpart H approval, where they approve it based upon this surrogate endpoint that predicts these endpoints. And so you get to run your trial, you get to generate the revenue that will support conducting that longer term trial. But then let's go back to, you are that patient, you're in the trial, 50-50 chance that you're going to be on placebo, and you're watching your disease progress. So what are you going to do? Are you going to go, well, for the good of science, I'm going to take on the risk that I'm going to die? Or I can go to my physician, they can prescribe this drug, my insurance company will pay for it, but this is my life, and so I'm not going to stay in the trial. Well, look, I work in pharma. I'm a scientist. I would not stay in the trial myself. I'm not going to have my health deteriorate and watch it deteriorate for the good of science. I'm sorry. I am selfish. And that happened. And a really good example of this is a company called Intercept, and they have a drug for treating a rare disease, primary biliary cholangitis. And they really have presented very compelling data showing the placebo patients who progressed, they stopped being on placebo. They went on study drug. And when the trial read out not showing a treatment effect, not because there wasn't a treatment effect, I mean, that the patients who were on drug did very, very well. The problem is so many of the placebo patients went on drug that you couldn't observe a difference between the groups anymore. So the FDA is in this catch-22. You have a rare disease, you have patients with no alternatives, you have a drug that is highly likely to work, and you've shown that it is, but you also have to do this placebo-controlled trial, and it makes keeping patients on placebo really, really difficult. And that is why these external control groups are so critical, because you can go to the real world data. You can find untreated patients. Now, the FDA prefers that they be concurrent with the clinical trial itself. And frankly, with a database like Komodo, you can put together those synthetic control groups with concurrent patients with your trial. But the FDA has also said, look, you can use historic data too. You just have to prove that nothing has happened since those historic patients and the current ones in the trial that would contaminate that. But again, size matters. I mean, you've got these really large databases. You can find equivalent patients who are not being treated. And again, we're going back to, they're being treated in the community. They're being treated by doctors who have, 2,700 patients who are not on the forefront of every new rare disease treatment. You can find these external control patients to be able to bring in. So I would say, more and more what we're seeing pharma companies saying is, look, we're going to do the placebo-controlled trial, which is what the FDA wants. But we're going to go to the FDA and say, look, there is every reason to believe it's going to be impossible to keep the placebo patients in and to have an uncontaminated placebo group. So we want to add an external control, and we want to specify the conditions under which we will use that as our primary basis for approval. So we are seeing right now more and more companies, especially we've gotten Subpart H approval, saying, you know what, we're going to add this external control because our expectation is the placebo group is going to get contaminated, and we need a comparator group for this trial.
This feels like a little bit of an emperor has no clothes situation, right? Because in this specific cases, it's very obvious that people don't want to be on the placebo because the drug is accessible to them. But then we ask, like, in general in trials, is it ethical to make people be on the placebo when the drug that could save their lives is accessible to them? I mean, to me, it sort of sheds a larger question on, in general, if we can avoid placebos, shouldn't we?
That is a great question. So at Liver Forum last year, an investigator for one of these trials stood up and said, I am not, and I did not keep patients whose health was deteriorating on your placebo. He goes, I took a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. Frankly, it was unethical for me because the impact on the surrogate was huge, and I can expect that to translate. So yes, as a physician, it was unethical for me to keep them on. And frankly, there were other physicians who stood up and said, yeah, sorry, I'm with you. Now, it's one thing if you truly have no idea if your drug, if you haven't done this surrogate endpoint, then I think it's perfectly fair to keep a patient on placebo because you just don't know. When you have proven that it has a significant impact on the surrogate that predicts the endpoints, the ethical conundrum has been raised in New England Journal of Medicine. Is it ethical to keep them on placebo? And frankly, if your trial site physicians are saying no, then the answer is no, it's not.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Webb? I know it's a thorny one.
I think it just speaks to the importance of looking across, the importance of having the ability to look across so many different disease areas, so many different patient populations, because you will see this being examined on a case by case basis, on a therapeutic area by therapeutic area basis. And as you would expect, to Tracy's point, in something like PBC, where there's so few patients, and it's the difference between something that provides a potentially life-saving alternative versus not, versus, you're looking at the next antihypertensive in market that's, seventh, eighth in class. Those will be stark differences in how researchers think about whether or not we should do a, multi 9-figure placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial involving thousands of patients, or whether we need to be more creative in looking at real world data, powering synthetic control arms, so that we don't have to actually face the decision of whether or not we put patients on a placebo arm for something where they have terminal disease.
There are multiple ways of designing this too, by the way. So you can have your fully external control, but there are also hybrid designs that a lot of people like Frank Rockwell at Duke talks about, where you are recruiting your placebo arm, and at the same time you are doing an external control. And after a year, you take a look at the external control and your placebo patients. And there's something called an index of dissimilarity. And if what you find is, gee, our external control really does look just like these placebo patients, you can then cross over your placebo patients to treatment, essentially take the training wheels off of your external control and allow it to function as a full control arm. So in terms of design, there are many different ways of approaching it. And the other piece is Komodo did a fully real world trial. Their drug was on the market for 8 years. So there were patients who had been treated for years, and there were untreated patients who looked like them. So in that case, it doesn't even have to be synthetic control. In those circumstances, you can actually do fully real world, they're called synthetic trials, purely synthetic trials with both treated and untreated patients in the real world. So in terms of design, there are actually a lot of different options for using real world data to demonstrate safety and efficacy.
In the few minutes we have left, I really just want to take stock of, like, where are we now on this stuff? How much are these being used? What are the areas where they are being used? What are the barriers to maybe areas where they could be beneficial or ought to be, but aren't? And when we talk about kind of more broadly, I guess, non-traditional control trials.
I'll start just by saying, as the industry figures out how to actualize RWE powered studies for regulatory approval, partnerships and companies like Komodo and Slipstream are incredibly well positioned to jump on the opportunity for real world data driven CRO best practices. We're already working together on that. Tracy is at the bleeding edge when it comes to innovation in driving some of these initiatives. And Tracy, I'm sure you have a lot of ideas and thoughts here.
In oncology and also in pediatric indications, that division has really been on the forefront. There have been a number of drugs that have been approved. For example, the CAR T therapies were approved with external controls as part of the primary basis for approval. So oncology, and Dr. Pazder, to his credit, credit, has been at the forefront of this. Really, in 2016, where Congress told the FDA, look, you're going to have to figure this out, so make it happen, that they began to develop this. And it was only in 2021 and 2022 that they came out with the guidances, the cookbooks for how to use the real world data, real world evidence for this purpose. As the mother of necessity, Intercept was moved at a pace that I think was just faster than what the FDA was anticipating. And, very exciting. Just a couple of months ago, the FDA accepted their SNDA submission. So for the first time under these new guidances, we have an SNDA package that's going in for review. There will be an AdCom sometime later this year. So there will be a lot of insights in terms of the FDA's approach. The other piece is, when these guidances come out, the FDA doesn't have a crystal ball. They do their best. But whenever a new guidance comes out, there are always some landmines that aren't anticipated. And I got to tell you, one of the landmines is the incredible data size. For example, we've been working with Komodo, even in PBC, it was a terabyte worth of data. I'm on the IT side. We ran that through Pinnacle 21 and it crashed it. We're working with Viva because the RIM system wasn't set up with Viva to accommodate that amount of data. The FDA portals weren't designed with this kind of data size in mind. And now think about NASH,
Right.
where with PBC, we identified 140,000 patients. Now imagine NASH, where you identify 50 million patients.
Right.
These are data sets that are far beyond anything the FDA anticipated. People are always asking me, what is going on here? You spent your life in pharma. What are you doing at an IT company? The reason is it takes the kind of IT infrastructure to be able to work with these data and to be able to work with the FDA to allow these data to be submitted. And I think we're going to see some evolution of some of these programs that are the envelope around these sorts of submissions that are going to have to evolve to accommodate it. Because I don't know how we would have gotten a NASH submission. And at this point, I think it would have been impossible. Truth of the matter is, more and more companies are now beginning to look at this. At the very forefront was Intercept, but other companies with these Subpart H approvals, some of them, my God, that Subpart H approval is 15 years old, and the FDA is cracking down right now. In fact, Pastor with the oncology division had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago, and he said, this is not going to be acceptable anymore. It's not acceptable now. You're going to have to do your overall survival trial. So companies are now looking to say, in clinical trials, we're not going to get it done. We're going to have to call upon these real world data sources to fulfill our obligations to the FDA. So the bottom line is the time has come, it's happening. And it's an exciting time to be working in this field. We are at the forefront.
We are at the forefront, and you bring up two important points. One was one of the comments I made earlier around therapeutic area specific assessments of how companies should be designing and executing against their trials. Your exact example around NASH versus rare is the perfect case study. And it also brings to mind what I had shared around the importance of whether or not there are therapeutic alternatives, whether or not the disease is terminal. Those are the kinds of things that regulators are going to have to look at. So TA specific considerations is very important. And then the second piece is the technology piece. Komodo was created as a company operating at the intersection of data plus technology. And the reason is because in order to unlock those analytics capabilities, in order to create what we've now trademarked as the healthcare map, in order to bring other assets on and then do the certs required to go help support and enable our partners, all of that requires the ability to go examine different parts of the healthcare system, look at different patient costs and outcomes considerations. And, some of the tooling that we've created has literally been designed to say, I want to examine a cohort that looks like this with these types of patient level features. And now I want to see what's happening to those patients longitudinally. Now, what happens if I change these specific features, whether it be age, whether it be race, whether it be ethnicity, whether it be some other demographic consideration, and immediately be able to see in real time, right at your fingertips, the impact on what that patient journey looks like and how it changes. Those are the kinds of capabilities that we've unlocked through software insights workflows, paired with the underpinning of the most comprehensive understanding of patient costs and outcomes, and all of that being able to really enable and accelerate research initiatives across every disease area, across every stage of the product life cycle, and across every function in enterprise life sciences.
And there will be learnings along the way, and not just pharma companies that are learning. but the FDA as well. This is new territory for them, so it will be interesting to see how this unfolds. I'm sure we didn't step on the last landmine that people will find on this journey.
This has been absolutely great, guys. I wish we could keep the conversation going. I'm definitely at the upper end of what we like to do for a podcast. But any final thoughts from either of you, or especially like speaking to our audience and folks in pharma, big pharma, small pharma, what do you want people to take away from this conversation about what's possible here and what's desirable?
I think for me, it just goes back to the original point. We're at this incredible inflection point in industry where we have an opportunity to really embrace and actualize RWE, real world evidence powered studies for regulatory approval. It requires domain expertise across some very specific capabilities and subject areas. So you have, just as I alluded to, you have data, you have the need to understand how to work with it. You have the decision to make as to whether or not you go make multi-million-dollar, multi-year investments into everything from your data lake, your data strategy for starters, to your data lake, to your data warehouse, to your in-house IT capabilities, and all of that, or partnering with companies whose mission is to reduce the disease burden and to really bring those capabilities to life. And so when I think about what we've done here at Komodo in terms of investing in data strategy, data partnerships that we accelerate through Map Enhance, all of the use cases that are unlocked through our software-driven insights workflows, and how that really creates a new window for partners to examine, to assess patient journeys over time. We're just at an incredibly exciting point in time. And I think it is creating a viable alternative for life sciences companies, for researchers, and for regulatory bodies to make different and potentially better decisions as to how we design and execute clinical trials.
Echoing everything you've said, top of that, especially for companies that have gotten Subpart H or are looking to have Subpart H approval, don't adopt the wait and see. Well, we'll see if the patients jump out of the placebo group. Look, put yourself in the patient's seat. You wouldn't wait. They're not going to stay on placebo when there's a viable treatment alternative available. So don't wait until the end when the trial doesn't read out and you see, oh my God, our placebo is contaminated. Have those discussions with the FDA now. There is, I like to call it the insurance policy. Even if you are confident all your patients are going to stay in placebo, take out the insurance policy. Have that discussion with the FDA that synthetic control in the aisles. So if that trial, it comes to the end and your placebo patients went on drug, that you have a viable group to do your comparisons, and you're not now rushing at the end of the trial after it's read out to try to put all this together to salvage your $50 or $100 million trial. This avenue is available now. Have that discussion with the FDA.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so much. I'm glad we were finally able to do this. I'm sorry it took so long, but I think it was well worth it to have the conversation. And if you're listening to this, you're interested in exploring this maybe more than you have, you know where to find Webb and Komodo and Tracy at Slipstream. So thank you guys. Yeah, good luck with all this work.
Thank you so much.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.